May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. They told him about her at once. We hear yet again in the Gospel of Mark the urgency. Jesus came to us in person. He came to us as the incarnation of God because God knew we needed God. And so the urgency in Mark seems quite fitting today in this world that we live in. Sometimes some of us that preach the Gospels over the years, we like some of the others. You know, the stories are more fleshed out and there's more detail. And yet Mark calls us to an urgency this year that I think we may just be finding out is important. Just imagine for a minute, let's just set the stage for a second. In the very first chapter of Mark starts off the beginning of the gospel, 1:1. Jesus arrives onto the scene with a heaven-splitting event with his baptism. Then he goes and he deals with Satan in the wilderness. He just takes care of business. Then he announces the impending reign of God on the earth. He chooses his first disciples, and then he shows his power over a demon. And all that has happened by the time chapter 1 to 28. So Jesus has come to take care of business. Jesus has come to be God incarnate in our lives. Jesus has come to help us know how to continue to create the kingdom of God in our midst. Annie Dillard, an author, in one of her books, The Writing Life. Many of you have heard this before, I'm sure, but she says, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. Just think about that for a second. How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives. If we think back, how is it that we maybe are waiting? You know, how often have we said, well, when I get done this, then I'll do that. When I get done this, maybe I could take some prayer time. If I get all this done, maybe I could do something. If I ever retire, some of the most profound prophets and disciples in the church are those of you that have retired. When I retire, then I can fill in the blank. And how did Jesus spend his days? How is it that the urgency that we're called to right now in the world, what is Mark trying to tell us? So in that light of how we spend our days, let's think about how did Jesus do that today? Well, the first thing he does is he makes home sacred. So many of his healing miracles or the times he connects with people or his conversations are done in homes or intimate settings. He sees people where they are. He meets them where they are. Today, when he walked into Andrew and Simon's house, they immediately told them that she was sick. He didn't wait for them to bring him to her. There didn't need to be any hubbub. He just went to her. And in the home, he didn't do anything spectacular except he reached out and lifted her up. If we continue through the stories that we know of the Gospels, we imagine all those times when Jesus healed or created times. It was in homes or intimate times. It wasn't in church. It was in home. The second thing he does is he heals. He heals over and over again. And how does he do that? He does that by reaching out. He does that by reaching out, by listening. He listened to Andrew. He listened to Simon. He showed up and he was present. Of course, one of the hard things about all these healing stories is Barbara Brown Taylor, who is a famous preacher and writer, she says it's hard to hear the healing stories and not want one of your own. And isn't that true? How many times when we hear a healing story, especially as we hear it during a pandemic, we hear, if God could heal this person or that person, why doesn't God stop the madness? And yet that's not the story that we have today. We have a story of a Jesus that shows up and listens and reach out and then calls us to go forward. But I'm getting ahead of the story. The next thing he does is he liberates and commissions. We had a wonderful conversation, Martha Burton and those of us in the lectionary study group this week, and I'm quite sure I did not convert her at all. That the idea of course, she reached out and she was healed, and then she immediately got up and started serving the men. And I doubt there are many women that have ever kind of wrestled with issues of autonomy and authority and self-worth that don't hear that and go, yeah, of course she does. And we do, especially as women, need to lean into knowing that we are God's beloved and that we are not called to be doormats. But I would offer a different slant on this, as I've spent, especially since Wednesday, and our really, what do I want to say, heated, really wonderful discussion about this on Wednesday. That come to find out, the word served that is used is the same verb that's used when Jesus talks about washing the feet of the disciples that last night. That service, that diaconal service, that caring for the other. So I would submit, and I say this as a woman who also thinks this is just so important for us to think, that perhaps this woman was the first called deacon. Perhaps Jesus knew that she was listening and could hear. And perhaps her service wasn't just making dinner for the men. Maybe it was spreading the gospel, the healing words of God that were so necessary and urgent. Maybe she became a yet living example of the healing, empowering love of God. So in that way, Jesus continues in his life to liberate and commission and empower people through his healing to go forth into the world and spread that gospel message. And then he prays. We forget sometimes if we have a good event, if we have a good season of evangelism, you must be evangelists. We forget to remember. You're supposed to go out, go, do. We forget that every time Jesus does something, one of the necessary steps that Jesus takes over and over again is he steps back, finds space alone and away, and he prays. And he spends time with the God that sent him. Sometimes he spends time lamenting, God, are you sure? Was this such a good idea? Sometimes I imagine he gives thanks. Sometimes I imagine he says, God, I am really sick of this. Sometimes he fill in the blank, but he steps back, he steps away, and he prays, because we must do that. And then as the disciples are busy running around, because they are running around trying to find Jesus, because Jesus is their center, they have yet to find out. They have yet to find out that we don't get to stay in one place, fixed on one person. They have yet to find out that God is in fact born in each of us. That's the Christmas message. So they're busy looking for Jesus because Jesus is their center. They look around and they say, let's get back. And what is Jesus' message? Jesus' message is, no, we must move on. We have much work to do. We have much work to do. So as we find ourselves in this time of epiphany, those of us that think ahead or have to think ahead, start to know that Lent is just on the cusp. as we still, I am sticking my heels in. I want to stay in the light for just as long as I can, I admit that. And so, how is it that we are the light? Where do you see the light? I was reading this week in our morning prayers, we need to live a life that intercedes. How is it that when we think about intercessory prayer, we think about it in terms of prayers of the people, we think about praying for each other? How are our lives an intercession? Well, the only way they can be an intercession, the only way they have a hope of being such a thing, is if we are released of those bounds, those bindings that we prayed at the very beginning. The only way we have a chance of being that light of Christ in the world that it is urgent right now to be. Because God is love. God isn't condemnation. God isn't judgment. God isn't violence. God is love and care and compassion. And so the way that we are able to be that intercessor in the world, the way we are able to be that God with skin on in the world, is if we can let down those things that bind us. Those if you think about binding, things that could cover your eyes or cover your mouth, keep you from seeing or hearing or being seen or being heard. And in our very beginning words of our worship this morning, we ask God to help us, help lift those binds. I'm going to finish this morning with a prayer that we also used on Wednesday, one that you've heard before. Nelson Mandela made it famous as he used it in his prayers, but Marianne Williamson wrote it. But it doesn't matter who wrote it. I think God wrote it. But I think it speaks to our need to be the light in the world in whatever way that means, and that is different for everybody. Maybe it's Sarah being able to text Kevin that something's gone fa-hooey. Maybe it's somebody serving dinner at the Dover Friendly Kitchen. Maybe it's somebody putting sand on ice so someone doesn't slip. I don't know how we live our life as though we are children of God, but I believe we're called to do that imperfectly, but we can do it no matter when. So this prayer says our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God, and your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. You were born to make manifest the glory of the God that is within all of us. It is not just in some of us. It is in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people that permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our fear, our presence automatically liberates others. They told him about her at once. The urgency of Mark calls us. Our presence automatically liberates others. How we spend our days matters. So how are we going to do that this week?